How could something this small, a postage stamp, change the fate of an entire country? Welcome to the Diplomatic Archives. Before the United States ever thought about building a canal, France had already tried and failed. In the 1880s, Ferdinand de Lesseps set out to build the Second Suez, a sea-level canal through the Isthmus of Panama, then part of Gran Colombia, a state encompassing today's Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. He promised that the isthmus would become a corridor of progress connecting oceans and civilizations. But the promises collapsed quickly. The tropical climate was brutal. Malaria and yellow fever wiped out over 20,000 workers, and money disappeared into a network of corrupt financiers. By 1889, the French Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique went bankrupt, and the scandal back home shook the Third Republic. What remained in Panama was a ruined landscape, half-dug trenches, abandoned machinery, and a legacy of death. Among the survivors was a French engineer, Philippe Bunau-Varilla, who had seen the chaos firsthand, and while others walked away, he became obsessed. He refused to believe the dream had died. For him, Panama was still the perfect site for a canal. The failure, he insisted, was not geography, but politics. When the French public wanted nothing more to do with the project, he made it his own crusade to sell Panama to someone else. At the turn of the century, the United States had begun to think of itself as a global power. The Spanish-American War of 1898 gave Washington new Pacific and Caribbean territories. Its navy now needed a shortcut between oceans. The U.S. viewed Latin America through the logic of the Monroe Doctrine, and under Theodore Roosevelt, this doctrine hardened. America would not just oppose European colonization, it would also enforce regional order itself. A canal linking the Atlantic to the Pacific fit this worldview. It was both a commercial and military necessity. Control the passage, control the seas. The only question was, where? By 1900, Bunau-Varilla was touring the United States. He had transformed himself into what an observer called the missionary of Panama. He told audiences that Panama was shorter, safer, and more efficient. Nicaragua, he warned, was a land of earthquakes and volcanoes, unstable and dangerous. He repeated this line in every speech, including before the Chamber of Commerce of New York. To prefer the Nicaragua route to the Panama route, he wrote, would mean to prefer the stability of a pyramid on its point to the stability of a pyramid on its base. His message was less about geography than persuasion. He appealed to the American pride, arguing that the United States, not the bankrupt French, could complete what Europe could not. His lobbying was relentless. He met with President William McKinley, secured the backing of influential Senator Mark Hanna, and convinced Charles Dawes, the controller of the currency, that Panama was the logical choice. Still, the French failure made Americans cautious. They wanted nothing to do with a corrupt legacy. But by 1902, Washington faced a choice. The United States needed a canal to connect its expanding Pacific and Atlantic fleets. The options were Nicaragua or Panama, and the decision would shape global trade forever. Many in Congress favored Nicaragua. The French companies still owned rights in Panama, and no one wanted to inherit its corruption or debts. But Bunau-Varilla was determined to reverse that perception, and he fought harder. Then, at the moment when his campaign seemed destined to fail, an unexpected symbol fell into his hands. In May 1902, volcanic eruptions on the islands of Martinique and Saint Vincent killed tens of thousands. The disasters terrified the public. A week before the Senate vote, Bunau-Varilla also received a letter from a Nicaraguan diplomat. The envelope was franked with a new Nicaraguan postage stamp, a volcano, Momotombo, erupting over a lake. Bunau-Varilla seized the moment. Nicaragua, his rival route, had a volcanic chain. Panama did not. Bunau-Varilla rushed to buy 90 of those stamps, glued them to letters addressed to every U.S. senator, and added a note. Quote, "An official witness of the volcanic activity in Nicaragua." The effect was immediate. That image, small, colorful, but issued by Nicaragua's own government, became the most effective propaganda of his career. As scholar Jack Child later observed, it was an example of the negative power of an icon when linked to a nation's name and exploited for political purpose. When the vote came on June 19, 1902, the Senate chose Panama by a margin of 8 votes. The U.S. now had a preferred route. The land where the canal would run was still part of the Republic of Colombia, successor to Gran Colombia, and not a willing partner. In 1903, the United States negotiated the Ay-Eran Treaty, which would grant the U.S. a renewable 100-year lease for the canal zone in exchange for $10 million and an annual rent. Colombia's Senate refused to ratify it as they saw it as a permanent foreign intrusion. They wanted better terms and more sovereignty. To Roosevelt, the rejection was an insult. He called Colombia's leadership inefficient and corrupt. If Colombia would not agree, perhaps Panama, a restless province, could act alone. Bunau-Varilla began corresponding with Panamanian elites who already resented Bogotá's taxation and neglect. He offered advice, funding, and connections in Washington. In the background, the U.S. Navy positioned ships off Panama's coast to, quote, protect American interests. Throughout October 1903, Bunau-Varilla coordinated with separatists from his suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. They demanded financial support to fund the militia, and he negotiated a sum of $100,000 in support and paid it himself. He helped draft Panama's Declaration of Independence and even designed its first flag, stitched together by his wife and a family friend from silk bought in Manhattan. He later wrote that he asked President Theodore Roosevelt directly for an American ship that would protect lives and interests during the revolt. Roosevelt said nothing, but Bunau-Varilla understood the silence as approval. On November 3, 1903, the uprising began. It lasted less than a day. Colombian troops sailed from Colón but were met with USS Nashville, which blocked their landing to protect American lives. 3 days later, the Republic of Panama declared independence. It was the birth of a nation and the beginning of a century of unequal partnership. Barely a week after independence, Bunau-Varilla appeared at the U.S. State Department with credentials naming him, quote, Panama's envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary. He had not been appointed by any Panamanian assembly. He had simply declared himself authorized. Nonetheless, Washington accepted him. And on November 18, 1903, he and Secretary of State Hay signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty. Under its terms, the United States obtained perpetual control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone for a sum of $10 million, an additional annual rent of $250,000. The ink was barely dry before Roosevelt celebrated what he called, quote, the triumph of civilization. For Washington, the deal meant dominance over the hemisphere's most strategic waterways. For Panama, it meant that sovereignty existed everywhere except where it mattered most. The U.S. took control of the construction in 1904, and over the next decade, more than 40,000 laborers from the Caribbean and Europe would build the locks and channels. The canal zone was treated as U.S. territory, where racial segregation structured every aspect of work. White Americans were paid in gold, black and mixed race laborers in silver. Finally, the canal opened in 1914, just as the First World War began. While it revolutionized global trade and military logistics, this meant that for the upcoming years, Panama would have to fight for its own sovereignty and control over the canal. The canal became a defining and dividing force for this small country that has such a heavy weight in world's global trade.